I feel especially, maybe we'll put them on the chair near you so that if people want, they can get. I feel a very special sense of halal and hodah tonight, meanings that could be found in head covering, and we also talked about the who of head covering, right? Who needs to cover her head? I want to do a drop more on who, just to kind of like dot the I's and cross the T's on the who question, but really what we need to spend the bulk of our time with tonight are the questions of how and where. Okay, and we're going to do our best to cover those as much as we can with the time we have. So just in terms of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, we talked last time about how fundamentally la halacha, a woman who is widowed or divorced, is supposed to be covering her head, but there can be room for leniency in certain situations, in particular cases of financial duress, or cases where it would get in her way of being able to remarry, and in some cases of real emotional distress as well. I increasingly hear about Rabbanim who have permitted it in those cases. Something I didn't mention last time, but I think it is important to mention, is that when the poskim talk about why there's room for that leniency with a woman who is divorced or widowed, what they cite, and in particular the poskim I have in mind, they're on the sheet, but we're not going to look at them right now, are Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Moshe Feinstein. Both of them say that because we learn the halacha of head covering, the fundamental law of head covering from the case of the Sota, who was by definition married, that we could argue that for a woman who has been married but is no longer married, that her obligation is no longer on a Torah level. And therefore, even though we don't treat rabbinic law lightly, there's more room, there's more comfort in making allowances. So for example, we talked about Rav Moshe's psak in terms of finances or dating. Rav Ovadia Yosef, and this is going to tie into something we'll discuss tonight, Rav Ovadia Yosef ordinarily is not in favor of women wearing wigs. He permits a woman who is divorced or widowed to wear a wig to cover her head. So that's an example of how this can find expression in different ways. The second little subgroup of who that I just want to kind of finish off discussing is a kala, a bride. At what point does a kala need to cover her head? It would seem from the Mishnah we saw that this young woman was going out to her wedding with her head uncovered. And we know that in Mishnaic times there actually was a gap between the two parts of Jewish marriage. Jewish marriage is effected in two stages. We have what's called erusin, or halachic betrothal. That's the ring giving, and hareat. That's the point at which a woman already assumes fundamentally the status of being an eshet ish at that moment, and yet it's not fully a marriage until after nisuin, which literally we translate as marriage, and then the question becomes, well, how do we define nisuin? It's actually a really interesting discussion about at what point, what counts as the second stage of marriage. And in fact, actually, there's a lot of things that could potentially count, and this comes into play in the discussion of kalot. So there is an opinion that already at the time of erusin, a woman should have her head covered, even though that's not a simple reading in the Mishnah. If we said that, then a woman would need to go to her wedding already with her head covered, because we now have erusin and nisuin right together. So, what's she going to do? In the middle of the ceremony, she's going to jump, this fraction, hareyat mikudeshet li, it's over. We read the ketubah, and now the second that we go into the next moment, how is that even working? We don't understand it. Exactly. So the position where a woman would come is either, this is interesting, it's either the position that really she should already be in erusin, or, for the same problem I just said, it's the position that it needs to be from nisuin, and nisuin here is defined as chuppah. Because also, according to that position, once we have erusin and nisuin, the two stages of the wedding, put together, when on earth is she going to do it? She's going to whip it out during the ksuba reading? It's not going to work. So that position, whether you're saying it's erusin already, or nisuin is defined by the initial chuppah, is satisfied by coming to the wedding already with your head covered, which is what some communities do. In particular, a lot of Hasidic communities also, it depends. I'm sorry? Okay, so, Another opinion, and this ties into, again, how do we define nisuin, the second stage of marriage? Another opinion is that this might be able to wait till yichud. Now, yichud is interesting because that would mean then that for an Ashkenazi kala, she comes out of the yichud room and suddenly her head is covered. That would be one possibility. Now, for Sfardim, that might give a little more room because Sfardim often, not always, but often don't have a separate yichud room. And therefore, they really could wait till after the whole wedding, in theory, if we say that yichud is the defining moment. Rav Moshe Feinstein actually has a ruling. It's on the sheet, source 52. He has a ruling that that we can wait till the next day. The next day, when it's not just yichud, but yichud that was really seclusion, but that was really for the sake of becoming consummated marriage. Now, irrespective of whether the couple actually consummated, but he would say that it would be the next day. An opinion I brought here, which I like in particular, because I think it's very. We talk a lot about last time about being malamed zchut, about judging favorably what people do, and this is, I think, a lot of people don't cover their heads at weddings. A lot of people do, and a lot of people don't. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, you know what? If you need to, let's actually read this inside source 53. Ach benogel lekisui kala bizman hachuppah ve'aseuda. Regarding covering the kala's head or hair at the time of the chuppah and the feast, even though the Mishnah Berurah thinks it's already from the point of erusin, and how much more so it should already be at the point at which we have our wedding feast. However, even so, if the kala doesn't want, or there's another some party to the wedding for whatever reason this is not working out, and he doesn't make a hard and fast rule about exactly why. He doesn't say it has to be, I don't know, on pain of death, or if for whatever reason this is not in the cards, yesh levater, you can let it go. Velismoch ala hinuma she'akalot mitkasot b'chach af al gav shezedak. And you can rely, if you need to, on the bridal veil, which covers the hair of the kala, even though it's thin or often transparent. So what Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is saying, which I think is actually a lovely thing and it's good to know, is if you want to, there's the ruling of Rav Moshe Feinstein that can be relied on, that could be said for Ashkenazim, that could be said that it's not till the next day. There's a ruling of Rav Ovadia Yosef and Sfardim in general, who don't practice a yichud at the wedding feast itself, that it can wait till after, also after yichud, which in effect would be the next day. If you want to be a little more concerned, or you're worried about, well, what about all these opinions that say it really should be earlier? Well, the kala has a veil on, so she just has, it can be on the back of her head. We're not necessarily, there are times where you're very particular about how someone's covering her head, and we're going to talk about the hows today. This would be a case where I think what Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is saying is also, we're not being super particular, right? The veil is not necessarily meeting our ordinary standards for head covering, but in the case of the wedding, that works. I just think that's a very nice psak, because it also gives another layer of meaning to the veil as well, that it's not just sort of covering in front, but it winds up being something meaningful for the kala after. So it's just good to know. Okay, let's get into our topics for tonight. We're going to start with how to cover. And let's start by looking at a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, source number 54. Hine etzem ha'isur ne'emar b'ktuvot, Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, Mikra devefara et Rosh Haisha. The fundamental prohibition, when we're talking about head covering, it's based on the verse in Parshat Naso, talking about the sota ceremony, and the Kohen would undo the woman's head. Azra livnot Yisrael shelo yetzu b'fara Rosh, which means that there is a warning to the daughters of Israel not to go out with heads uncovered. It doesn't say that the warning is that the daughters of Israel not go out with their hair uncovered. It says head uncovered. Mashma shetalui b'chashivut priya ala rosh b'kolel. It sounds like the fundamental Torah law is not about the hair, it's about the head. And it's about overall, Hashivut Torah Rosh HaKolel, overall is the head covered. That, says Rav Moshe, is the fundamental Torah law. V'gam ha'pashut, she'en l'melav me'akra isur ela ma shetzarich ha'kohen lifroa b'rosh ha'sotah. And he says not only that, it makes sense because the Kohen doesn't have to undo and uncover every single hair, get everything totally disheveled. He just has to do, he goes on to say, he just has to do most of the head. The big portion of the head is what he would need to uncover, and conversely, what we would need to cover. Okay, so Rav Moshe is saying the Torah level of this mitzvah is learned from the Sota. And the Torah level deen of the Sota, the halacha from a Torah level, is not about hair, it's about the head. And if the minimum, if the Kohen, it wouldn't have to be that every single centimeter had to be uncovered on the Sota. But he at least has to get it, so generally speaking, she's uncovered. Most of the head is uncovered. It means that on a Torah level, in general, the head needs to be covered. Okay? Dehu rov harosh, o l'chol hapachot karov l'rov harosh. The covering really should be most of the head, or something close to it. Okay. Now, if we think about this for a moment, if anyone else needs sheets, by the way, there's some extra sheets here. Please feel free to take. If we think about this for a moment, this brings us back actually to when we were talking about rationales for the mitzvah. Two of the main possible rationales that we discussed were dignity. We saw that Mishnah talking about how it was really a way of shaming someone to remove her hair headpiece in public, that this is a matter of dignity. You know, like we talked about Queen Elizabeth, the dignified woman goes out with a head covering. And we talked about modesty. We talked about the law that we learned from the Sota. And we talked about the idea of erva, and how it might even be that the idea of erva, or something being akin to nakedness, that might have been learned because the hair or the head was typically covered. And once something becomes typically covered, there's considered to be something unrefined or immodest about uncovering something that is generally meant to be or understood to be covered. What's interesting is that we might say that these are kind of two lines of thought in terms of thinking about the mitzvah. In a sense, we could say that when we talk about the Sota and when we talk about this idea of dignity, maybe that's really where we're talking about the head, a dignified head covering. And you could potentially say that when we talk about erva, or when we talked about dat Yehudi, which we defined as modest, what was modest accepted practice for the daughters of Israel, that there maybe we're talking more about hair, covering the hair. In other words, both of these aspects are represented. But it may well be that the fundamental Torah level is about the head and dignification, and that the other level, the Dat Yehudit level, and the erva levels come in where they're more about the idea of modesty. Of course, modesty and dignity are related concepts. But this is interesting to see, and one thing that you do see as you learn the different sources is that halachic authorities who emphasize more the erva side of things talk more about hair. And halachic authorities who emphasize more the sota side of things do tend to talk more about the head. Okay? And there are implications of this in terms of how to cover as well. So let's look back. Source 55 is going to remind us what we saw in the Gemara. Please. What we saw in the Gemara about minimum versus more maximal requirements of head covering. Doraita kalta shaper dami. Source 54. On a Torah level, this basket, a kalata, a kalta, this you know, we talked about shikita banana, right? There's something on your head. It's not really covering everything necessarily. It's on the head. On a Torah level, this is sufficient. Dat Yehudit afilu kaltanami aser. On a Dat Yehudit level, the modest accepted halacha for the daughters of Israel, that's not enough. And the question is, what's not enough about it? So the Meiri, who's an early Provençal halachic authority, in source 56 says this. He says, what's the difference between the kalta and a better head covering. He says, even though usually when we talk about the kalta, we're talking about this type of basket where a woman might put her spindles, he wants to suggest a different explanation here. By the way, in my analysis right now, I'm following my Rebbe, Rav Yehuda Herzl Enkin, and how he analyzed this particular discussion. B'kanireh sheperusho ke'en kova mibeged gas shetzonefet bo balayla. It's like some kind of hat made of some kind of coarse fabric that she puts on at night. It's like a nightcap. He's saying the kalta is actually not a basket. He thinks ordinarily a kalta is a basket. In this context, the kalta is more a nightcap. Now, if on a Torah level the kalta is sufficient, and it's this nightcap, but dat Yehudit, it's not, is he leaning more on the dignity end or on the modesty end? What do you think? Sounds to me more like dignity, because it's not so dignified to go out in your pajamas, or in your house robe, or in your slippers. Meaning if the idea of the head covering is that it dignifies the wearer, and you're going out and you're wearing your kind of like nightcap. I always picture Ebenezer Scrooge here, but we know that people wore like, proper nightcaps. So you're going out and you're kind of your shmata. It's not dignifying. It's not dignifying. Okay, so that's one possibility. On a Torah level, has your head been covered? Yeah, the head is actually covered. But have we really satisfied what Dat Yehudi wants? The Meiri says no. The issue seems to be more one of dignity. Rashi might suggest something different. Source 57, Rashi here describes it as the sal. He says it is like a basket. And in source 58, there's a version of Rashi that's brought down in one of the early compendia of early authorities called the Shita Mekubetzet. And he says, Afilu kaltanami lo, even a basket is not sufficient from the perspective of Dat Yehudit. Mishum tzniut, because there's a matter of tzniut here. It's not sufficiently tznius, modest. Because it's impossible that they won't see the hair through the kind of like the weaves, the fibers of the weave, the basket weave. You can kind of see through a mesh basket sometimes. So this is really interesting because what we have in effect are really these two kind of perspectives. What's the Torah and what's the Dat Yehudit? Is the Dat Yehudit that it really needs to be more dignified? Is the Dat Yehudit that it really needs to be sort of more maximal coverage, like better quality coverage through which you're not going to see the hair, right? So let's say a practical halachic difference would be like something stunning but see-through, right? A stunning, dignified head covering but see-through. So the way Rashi's explaining it, that's a non-starter. The way the Meiri's explaining it, maybe it would be okay. Or vice versa, we get back to the nightcap. Rashi might be delighted with the nightcap. It's providing very effective coverage. But the Meiri is not satisfied with the nightcap because it's not particularly dignified. Okay, so these strands come through. And now let's see how this kind of winds up playing out when we talk about the extent to which hair needs to be covered, because we know that the head being covered, or at least most of the head being covered, sounds now non-negotiable. And the question becomes, is there any room when it comes to hair being covered? And we're going to start with more stringent perspective, okay? And the classic source that's brought, this is source 59 for this perspective, is a story about a woman named Kimchit. And it's a sort of enigmatic Talmudic story. Shiva banim hayula lekimchit. Kimchit had 7 sons. The chulan shimshu b'kuna gdola, and all 7 of them were able to act as Kohen Gadol. I used to think, what, did they all die? No. The idea is that they had tuma, like there was ritual impurity, so the other one got a turn, something like that. But she merited that all of her sons had a moment of serving in the Mikdash as Kohen Gadol, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. 7, right? That's wow. So Amrullah Chachamim. Chachamim are astonished, and they figure. I bet if Chachamim could have talked to Yocheved, they would have talked to her also, right? What you have Aaron, you have Moshe Rabbeinu, you have Miriam. All of them are your kids. What did you do, Yocheved? So this is the kind of the later version. This is Kimchit. Kimchit, what did you do? How did you merit to have these 7 sons? And Masit shezachit lachach. What did you do that you could merit this? Amra lahem. She said to them, Lo miamai lo ra'u korot beiti kil'ei sari. In all my days, the beams of my house never saw the braids of my hair. My hair was never visible, i.e., if the walls have ears, we often say, so here's the walls have eyes. Effectively, what she's saying, my hair was always covered. And then the sages say, and this is where the story gets really enigmatic, then the sages say, Amrullah harbe sukain velo ho'ilu. There are many who have done this, and it didn't work for them. I.e., this is not a guarantee. So it's kind of a tricky story because you can really take this story in different directions. One direction you can take this story in is, well, Kimchit was certainly a praiseworthy woman. She did merit, it's a matter of fact that she merited to have these 7 sons who were Kohen Gadol, and she understood that the reason she merited it was because of what she did with her hair. And that's something we should take very seriously because she's absolutely a meritorious woman. And it sounds like she very well may be onto something. That's the thing she latched onto as being significant. Even if she wasn't 100% correct that it would work for everybody, for her, she felt that this is what tipped her over into another realm of being meritorious. That's one side. Another side could say, well, this is interesting because if she thinks that this is what made her particularly meritorious, then it sounds as though this was not the norm. This was not the standard or the expectation. Not only that, if you think about the sage's response to her, many have done that and it hasn't worked to them. It sounds like this is not an expectation for everybody. This is something that many women have done. This is not something that all the women do or that we tell all women to do. And then they add to that this business of, and it didn't work for them. So then suddenly we're on this other level of, So is this, do we take this at face value? This is a meritorious act. It's not going to work for everybody, but everybody it's worth a shot. Or do we take this in this other direction, which is, well, might have been a wonderful thing that she did, but fundamentally it's not the thing that made a difference, and it's not a basic expectation of every woman. Yeah?
When you have sons who are behind the development, didn't the sons have to keep dying so that the next son?
So I think ritual impurity would have been how they would have gone in, not through death. Okay, yeah, exactly. I think it's a question that comes up. Okay, now the Zohar takes this and brings it to another level. And just a little background, something that's important to know is for the Zohar, hair has like significance to start with. Hair is associated with judgment, or if you think about like Esav versus Yaakov, Esav is hairy, is seir, and Yaakov is not. There's a relationship, think Absalom, there's a relationship that the Zohar picks up on between hair and something strong, something that brings on maybe divine judgment. And it also, of course, picks up on this Gemara that we just read. So source 60, V'itata da'apik misara deresha labar letatkina bay. A woman who takes out from her hair outside some hair that's outside of the what she's set up on her hair, her head covering. Garim miskenuta leveta. She causes sorrow for her home. V'garim libna delo yitchashvum bedara, and she causes her sons not to be considered important in their place of residence. V'garim mila achra desharya bebeta, and she causes some kind of negative force. Mila achra, the other thing, it's not positive to be in her home. Gamrada husara ditchaze meresha labar. This is all caused by this hair that's seen outside of her head, or outside. Begin kach baya itta dafilu tsira debete lo yachmun sarachad miresha kol sheken lavar. Therefore, a woman should see to it that even a single strand of her hair not be seen by the walls of her home. They're obviously inspired by Kimchit. How much more so not outside? So the Zohar takes the kind of more straightforward reading of the Kimchit story, or a straightforward reading of the Kimchit story, and runs with it, and says, really, this is the thing to do. This is actually a spiritually dangerous force, leaving hair out. and really, hair should always be covered, even inside the home. This is not just a praiseworthy act of kimchi. This becomes now, in the words of Zohar, a normative practice. This is what you should do. And the Magen Avraham, who is a major halachic authority, comments on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, and he says, "Aval bezohar parshat naso hichmir meod shelo yireh shum se'ar meisha lo yera'eh shum se'ar meisha v'chein ra'oi linhog." He says the Zohar is super machmir, that not a hair of a woman should be seen, and so it is fitting to practice. Again, we have a double-edged source here. On the one hand, what did he call this? He called this a chumrah. Right? He says this is a stringency. It's not the basic law. And what does he say? He says it's ra'ui. It's fitting to do this way. It's not what's halachically required. And on the other hand, he's saying that from his perspective, this is the ideal way to go. Yes?
So is this when women decided to shave their heads? Like, when did that actually
Yafeh. Okay, so this is absolutely connected to that practice. The practice of women shaving heads, I don't know how far back it goes, at least a couple hundred years. But the practice, there's two reasons given for the practice. One is this, that we don't want any hair to be getting out of any head covering, and if head is shaved, that's certainly going to allow maximum control. The other reason that's given is mikvah, a concern that hair would not be properly prepared for mikvah, and if you shave it, then you'll never have any kind of an issue. So those are the two kind of explanations that are given for that practice. And it's definitely 100%. This is a major way in which that is rooted. And the Chatam Sofer, who is coming from a community where women shave. Bartzotenu sheomot yotzot pruei rosh v'imotenu lo yotzot v'nisaru me'od v'chashu l'divrei Zohar. In our lands, where outside the goyim are having their heads fully uncovered, and our women are very careful, like the Zohar. Haklala yotzei kol shum se'ar b'shum makom barosh v'padacha b'nisua afilu b'chadra ervahi. I consider every single, back to hair being associated with the erva perspective, right? Every single hair, if it's seen, could be considered to be tantamount to erva. Im lo sheyesh la mitpachat barosha uveshuk uvechatzer sharabim gam kova. We'll talk about his perspective about how much to cover Bezrat Hashem in a little bit. Okay, so the Chatzim Sofer reflects that tradition in his community. They were already shaving, to my understanding. Okay, so that's one perspective. That's the kind of maximalist perspective. But there's another perspective, and it's not that this other perspective is some new age thing. The other perspective also goes way back, and we see it in the Rishonim. Rashba, who's an early halachic authority, Catalonia, from the Beit Midrash of the Ramban. He says, Panea v'yadea v'raglea, in a woman, if her face, her hands, her feet, and her hair that is outside of her braid, which is not covered, we don't have an erva concern. He's saying we're not worried. Thank God. This is, one of the important reasons that we know that we don't have to cover our faces or our necks or our hands. This is not a halachic issue of erva, period. And would you like to come in? Okay, and among the things that he's saying are not a halachic issue is her hair that is outside of her braid. And of course the question is, well, what does that mean? Her hair that's outside of the braid. It's suggestive. It sounds like it means, maybe like those flyaway hairs, hair at the nape of the neck, hair at the temples. No matter. Some of us are better at this than others, but I'm a shlemazel when it comes to this stuff. There's always hair coming out. I feel like there's always hair. I tie it up, but there's always something that's escaping by even my best efforts. The Rashba kind of calms me down, right? It sounds like he's saying something slips out. That's not what we're talking about. That's not an erva issue. It's not a tznius issue. The Rashba says this is all. It's like her face. It's no different from the face, says the Rashba. And the Ramah paskins this way: Haga v'hu adin haserot shel nashim. And so it's also the law when it comes to women's hair, that comes out of the braid. Okay, so the Ramah also seems to pass this way. Once you say that there can be hair that comes out from the braid that's not considered to be an erva or a tznius issue, so what you're saying is that the halacha is not like kimchi. Kimchi, it is not mechayev, it's not obligatory, right? It's a perspective, but it's not obligatory on everyone. Maram al-Ashkar from Egypt. Vahid se'ar be'isha erva lo mairi ela be'se'ar shederach ha'isha l'chsoto. When we talk about hair being erva, it's hair that is customary to cover. And then he says something interesting. See, there's a Gemara which talks about, second line, a woman does all of her adornments and leaves a little bit. Maihi, what's this little bit she leaves? And Rav Amar bat sid'ah. Rav Amar, the little bit she leaves is the bat sid'ah. What's the bat sid'ah? And he explains. He says the bat sid'ah must be what women do nowadays, what's customary here in Egypt, which was sheisha kolat kol sarah, a woman braids all of her hair, umeshayeret se'ar hatzda'im yored al panea, and she lets a little hair from the side come onto her face. That's what the Gemara is talking about, the bat sid'ah. Kamoshni Bayerz was explained. Hikilu rabotenu kadei shelo titkanei isha al ba'ala. Our sages were lenient concerning this little bit of hair being left out, that a woman not be unappealing to her husband. There's a lot of discussion. It comes up in different Gemaras in different places about women and grooming and cosmetics. And one of the factors that comes up often with respect to women and cosmetics, it might come up on like, can she do something during Chol HaMoed? Or can a woman do something on when she's in a velus? One of the factors that comes up is that we see it as important to uphold a woman's grooming practices in general because that's part of the marital relationship. It's something that's there between them, and it might be important. We don't want to put a woman in a situation where it would be prohibited for her to look the way that she feels comfortable looking. We're concerned that might affect that kind of delicate dynamic between her and her husband. So it's an interesting idea, but basically what the Maharam al-Ashkar is saying is there's hair outside the braid that doesn't get covered. And this hair, it's not clear if he just means hair at the temples, or if he even means something almost like, what the Brits would call a fringe, or Americans might call bangs, or something like that. But if you've ever seen a very firm woman with all her hair covered, and then she has like bangs, so there's a good chance that she's relying on the Maharam al-Ashkar, okay? Which seems to suggest that that's not included in this halacha. And what's interesting is back to how we started. If the fundamental law is about the head, and then the hair is an issue of erva and snias on top of that, and that's also halacha, but it's a second level, dat yudit connected level perhaps. If we understand things in that way, and we say that part of how the erva status happens is what's customary to cover, then in effect it works very nice with the Maharam al-Ashkar. He's saying hair that's never been covered, that's never been customary to cover, and has nothing to do with the head being covered in a dignified and modest fashion, is not an issue. Okay, so that's his perspective. And then you have Rav Ovadia Yosef. This was quoted in a sefer called Etz Nuim HaChochma. I haven't been able to find this separately from Rav Ovadia Yosef, except from that book. Those who want to claim that there's a Torah prohibition for even a hair coming out and being seen, not correct. Because the custom of Sephardi women is to have one or two finger widths of hair exposed in the front. Okay? So back to like things we see sometimes. You have a woman with her head is maybe all covered, but in the front there's some hair showing. So 2 finger breadths it's a halachic measure in etzba. And etzba is 2 to 2.4 centimeters, so two finger breadths would be 4 to 4.8 centimeters. But I don't think Rav Ovadia Yosef means here that you're supposed to go with a ruler in front of the head. I think what he's saying is that what was customary among Sephardi women, to the best of his knowledge, and he knew, was that the head would be covered, but there would be a little hair showing in front, a little bit. It wasn't a super punctilious thing to have every hair in the front of the head always be covered. So there's, on the one hand, we have one strand of thought that talks about full coverage of every hair, and we have another that leaves room even within the rubric of dat yudit, and even when we're concerned for tzniut, for some hair to be uncovered. The most interesting ruling perhaps is Ramosha Feinstein. Ramosha Feinstein does something surprising. We touched on in our last class, and we also, I guess, sort of from the side talked about it here. The Rav Moshe Feinstein does not think the fundamental halachic issue with head covering is erva. He says the fundamental issue is what we learned from the sota, and erva is a secondary issue, as it were. Even so, when Rav Moshe Feinstein is trying to work out, well, how much hair could a woman potentially show? What he does is he takes the measurements that are used in discussions of erva. In other words, there's a Gemara that talks about tefach be'isha erva. A tefach is like a handbreadth, right? So if 2 etzbaot, a tefach is like 4 etzbaot. Makes sense, right? 4 etzbaot, handbreadth, you can even see it. Okay? He says, well, there's a Gemara that says that if up to a tefach, if up to, it's like, works out to somewhere between 8 to 9.6 centimeters, is exposed of an area of the body that's usually not exposed, that's still permissible, say, from an erva perspective, for a man to recite Shema in the presence of that. So what Rav Moshe does is he says, when I'm trying to figure out exactly how much hair a woman could leave uncovered, I don't want to just pull a measurement out of nowhere. I want to base it on something. If the measurement for erva is that up to a tefach could be left uncovered, then, and we know that the laws of erva will wind up being applied to head covering, then we could use this measurement for head covering too. So this is source 67. Because the whole head becomes a covered place of the body, then the prohibition becomes like covered parts of the body like erva. And therefore, because when it comes to usually covered parts of the body, there's a distinction between uncovering a tefach of that or uncovering less. We can make that distinction when it comes to hair as well. So what Rav Moshe Feinstein winds up saying is that up to a tefach of hair can be uncovered. So far what we've seen is we've seen the position of the Zohar that said, based on the Gemara, right? That's a reading of the Gemara that said, everything be covered, and the Magen Avraham thinks that's a good chumrah to take on. And we know that there are communities that have embraced this in a very, very passionate way, to be a very, very strong minhag in those communities. We also have the position we saw, starting with the Rashba, that there can be these kind of stray hairs that don't count as being an issue. Moving on to the Maram al-Ashkar, who's talking either about hair at the temples or bangs, some kind of fringe not being an issue. And then we have Rav Moshe, who tries to put a kind of number on it. Okay. Oh, we had Rav Avad Yosef, who talked about 2 etzbaot, and Rav Moshe, who says up to a tefach. Now, one of the interesting things that you can start playing around with is, what does that mean? Like, is it up to a square tefach? It seems like he means up to a square tefach. Now, you might have seen women who, let's say, a lot of the hair is covered, but then there's like a patch in the back that's uncovered, or maybe a little bit in the front is uncovered and a patch in the back. So oftentimes what they're doing in that case is adopting the ruling of Rav Moshe, where I don't know that Rav Moshe anticipated this, but they're basically saying, well, if the limit, according to Rav Moshe, would be up to a tefach being uncovered, who says it has to be here? It could be here, it could be here. It could be some combination thereof, right? So that seems to be where that's coming from. It's important to know that Rav Moshe didn't think this was an ideal. Meaning, he said this was good enough that from his perspective, a Talmid Chacham could marry a woman who did this, and she's not doing anything that's considered to be a transgression. And at the same time, he thought it was fitting to cover more. So it's important to say that he did think it was fitting to cover more, but he thought that the halacha was that up to a tefach could be uncovered. Now, there's one other position that's very important to bring out here, and that's the position of Rav Nachum Rabinovich. Rav Nachum Rabinovich was a posek in Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Hester Ma'ale Adumim. Prior to that, he was originally, I think, Canadian. He was in, is he Canadian or American? Anyway, fine, Canada's in America. I'll stop while I'm behind. But he was in England for some time, and then he came and he was Rosh Yeshiva and posek from Ma'ale Adumim. And he said something like this. He says, well, wait a minute. Rav Moshe himself said that the fundamental issue is in erva. And Rav Moshe himself said that the Torah level is satisfied by covering most of the head. Why do we have to say that the maximum that could be uncovered is a tefach? Maybe it suffices for most of the head to be covered, and then in matters of dat yudit to follow what's normative custom. So let's just see how he says this inside, source 69. Ulam gam shetzarich kisui. Even when covering is required, imiktsat min hase'ar yotzei mechutz lakisui, gam ze beseder. If a minority of the hair, now it's not clear if he means literally less than 50% or if he means just a little bit. The word miktsat is kind of ambiguous. Is uncovered, it's acceptable. And then he says, and the Beit Yosef, who's the Machaber of the Shulchan Aruch, says, brought the Rashba, who also said this in the name of the Ravad, and we talked about this, the hands and the hair that's coming out. Lisikum, second to last line of Siach Nahum, source 69. Mikara din sarich lechasot et rov se'ar rosh. The fundamental halacha is that most of the hair on the head needs to be covered. Ava mutar lo tzik tzat se'ar, but it's permissible to take out a little bit of hair. By the way, that's also a little different if you think about it. The Rashba was talking about hair that got out. Maram al-Ashkar seemed to be talking about hair that was left out. Rav Nachum seems to be talking about hair that's taken out. V'lav davka shiur misuyam, and not necessarily a specific upward amount, as long as ela kafi hanahug b'chevra shel shomrei Torah mitzvot. Ela hi mishtayachet, in accordance with the practice of the Torah following a community where she follows. So there's a lot of people, and this is important because this has had a big effect in Israel. There's a lot of people who follow Rav Nachum's psak, and that means that they cover most of their head, but then they leave hair out, aside from that. Now, somehow in Israel, in some quarters, this has evolved to being also less than that, like more like almost like a bandana kind of a thing. That's a little trickier. I've heard people say orally that they heard a more lenient position of Rav Nachum that they could rely on for that. It's also not something to belittle, because for a lot of women, doing anything at all with this mitzvah is already tremendously difficult. And there is a way in which some things are accomplished. There's that some of the head is covered, that aspect of a dignified head covering, there's some element of that. The rationales, there's a nod to modesty. There's a nod to dignity. There's, even though it's not a reason for the mitzvah, there is a signaling of being part of the Jewish community. There's a signaling of being married, meaning for women who just, let's say, wear a headband. Now, some women do a headband and also like a fall or something like that. But for a woman who just wears a headband, if it can cover rove of the Rosh, if it can cover most of the head, that's definitely better halachically and more in line with at least what Rav Nachum put in print. If it can cover everything except for a tefach, that's satisfying Rav Moshe's standard. But it is important to know that I don't think anyone should belittle or dismiss women who are making some effort to fulfill this mitzvah, even if it's not necessarily with a lot of halachic support. And that's important to know, and that's accepted, and there are some communities where that's very widely accepted. And in a sense, you could say that's sort of one of the tricky things about this halacha to start with, is we begin with the discussion both of the Torah and of dat yudit. And dat yudit from the beginning is defined as the modest things that Jewish women do. So it's hard to, there are different views about, is that something that's absolute and unchanging for all time? Or is there some wiggle room? To say less than a majority of the head is still not simple halachically. There's a lot more halachic support at the least to cover most of the head. But it is important to understand that part of this is a natural outgrowth of this mitzvah is supposed to be reflective of what women do and what women learn from each other. And that can be sometimes with more halachic basis and sometimes with less, but it's part of the dialogue about the mitzvah from the beginning. Yeah?
So let's say someone does, like you mentioned before, for example, like someone showed over here, does it make a difference of the length of hair that's, let's say, out?
Okay, so
Like you mentioned bangs, which is here. Is there a
right.
difference between that or someone who has like very long?
So that's a good question. So if you think about it, back to it's sort of like how many opinions are you satisfying a little bit, right? Like if you want to satisfy the Zohar, you're not going to show anything. If you want to satisfy the Rosh, but basically you have your head covered, and if something slips out, lo nora, it's okay, right? If you want to satisfy the mara malashka, something might, mara malashka, there might be a little bit of a bang, a little bit of a fringe, a here, there, a here, there. It's a question of how much, and I think there are different interpretations of this, and it's tricky because he doesn't specify. Rav Ovadia Yosef is telling you, right, 2 etzbaot up front. It's not, I don't know that it would be a difference if it's here or here. I think it might be a little more difficult to say that it's both bangs and behind, but I don't know that you couldn't make that argument either, meaning they weren't sitting there, again, even Rav Moshe, when he's giving a measurement, I don't think what he really meant was for Jewish women to start using rulers every morning. I don't think that was what he was getting at. He was talking about the spirit of the thing is that on the whole, the head should be covered except for about a tefach. My Rebbe Rav Henkin, this Rashi in source 70, talking about, we saw last time the Mishnah that a woman who was a virgin who went out to her wedding, Dafka had her head uncovered. Rashi explaining the Mishnah said, Itztivlida se'ara al ktefer. Okay, he said her hair is on her shoulders. So Rav Henkin wanted to suggest that if Rashi defined uncovered or undone hair as being on her shoulders, that maybe that's like an absolute limit, like the hair shouldn't be on the shoulders. But one of the tricky things here again is that this is something that was passed on traditionally, and then some of these traditions get lost, and we're trying to figure out what to do based on, and it's a lot of different factors that get put together in terms of how a woman figures out where she goes in the halachic spectrum of how. I think it's important to know the different opinions, even if your community might be more stringent or more lenient. And the reason why I think it's so important to know is because I've met many women who, in the beginning, it was a huge struggle in doing anything at all, felt almost impossible. And conversely, I've met women who, in the beginning, covered everything and over time felt the need to uncover some, and that became extremely important to them for different reasons in their lives. So I think it's important to be aware that within the world of halacha, there are different perspectives on this. And at the same time, yeah, we have communities, we have community norms, and it's very much kind of this personal dialogue with where do I fit within my community? Which poskim do I look to? If in general you're a Talmidah of Rav Nachum, so it's much more simple to follow Rav Nachum Labriut than if you're not. If in general you follow Psakim of Rav Moshe Feinstein, it's much more simple to follow Rav Moshe Feinstein than if you don't. That kind of a thing. But ultimately, I'm not going to paskin for anybody in this room. That's not my job. But I think it's important to know that there are these different opinions and where they come from, and that it's not all absolute. The way that sometimes it might be presented as, oh, even a hair come out, that's the end. It's not all absolute, even though there are some communities that are even careful for the single hair. Okay? Okay, we have just enough time to talk a little bit. Oh, okay, we don't have a lot of time. I want to talk briefly about wigs, and then we'll talk about where. Yes, how much time do we have?
Meaning the woman joining the workshop isn't here yet. So.
Okay, so that helps us, but I don't want to, when she comes, we need to stop. I don't like to be rude. Okay, wigs. So there's a really interesting Mishnah, Masechet Shabbos. There's a whole discussion in Shabbos about how you can go out into the public domain, what can be on your person. And one of the concerns is that you don't want to have something on your person in the public domain that you might be inclined to remove. Even if it's something you would remove just to show to someone else. Why? Because if it's something that you might remove, it's also something that you might wind up carrying, and then we get into big problems of hotzah, right? We guess the eruv wasn't as prevalent everywhere as it is right here, right now. And one of the items that you're allowed to go out with as a woman on Shabbos, source 71, Yotzah Isha, a woman goes out, b'pe'ah nochrit l'chatzer. She can go out to her courtyard with a pe'ah nochrit. What's a pe'ah nochrit? In modern Hebrew, pe'ah nochrit is how we refer to a wig. Now, if you actually look at the Rashi, I didn't bring it, but Rashi here seems to be describing something a little bit more like a hair extension. Like she takes someone else's hair and braids it into her own. That sounds to me more like a hair extension than a wig. But still, it's a similar idea. In other words, we have this Mishnaic source for a woman going out with something that looks like hair, and it's not her hair, and it's okay. So what might we infer from that? Could infer that, hey, wigs might be okay. And indeed, Shiltei Giburim of Yoshua Boaz, source 72. נראה מזה להביא ראיה וסמך לנשים היוצאות בכיסוי שערות שלהן כשהן נשואות, אבל במקום כליאת שערה נושאות שערות חברותיהן. You can find a proof in this to rely on for the women who go out with covering heads when they're married, and instead of and what they do is in the place of where their braids would be, they put someone else's hair. Right? I love that line, Serot Chavrotean. Their fellow women's hair is what they put on. Umashma lahed yesh mutarot b'not Yisrael litkashet behen. And it sounds clear that it's permissible for a woman to adorn herself with this. When we talk about erva and hair, what we're worried about is hair that's actually stuck to her skin. Mamash, really stuck to it. You see the hair coming out of the flesh. That's what it's talking about. Now this is really interesting because I think it hits on both sides of wigs. Like one of the reasons that some people don't like to wear wigs is because they look fake. And to the extent they look fake, it's because the hair's not coming out of your head. And that's exactly the grounds for the heter. But on the other hand, the tension is that nowadays we have wigs that look very realistic. We have wigs that are really, some of these amazing lace cap wigs. I think people who know. I'm not very good at it, but I think the people who know always somehow know. But the people who don't know really wouldn't know. Sometimes, it's nicer than, it looks nicer than someone's hair and super realistic. And so you have this interesting tension where the permission seemed to have been based in part on the fact that to the hair is covered. Of course it's covered. Her hair is covered, right? If there's someone else's hair on top of it, then it's covered. So to the extent that then we're talking about some tznius or erva issue, if there's something else on it that doesn't look like it's coming from her skin, then it's clear that it's something else, and it's not akin to nakedness and being uncovered. It's uncovered and it's clear. So we have this real tension now where wigs don't clearly look covered or foreign. So in practice, we tend to be very lenient about this. Why do we tend to be very lenient about this? I think for reasons we've talked about here already, because it's really hard for women to cover her head. And being able to wear a wig there's a halachic history to it, and it enables a lot of women to feel more comfortable with it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe in particular was especially fervent in supporting women wearing specifically wigs. If you know Chabad, in Chabad, it's absolutely the norm in Chabad to wear wigs. And the reason why is because he felt that if a woman's wearing a wig, and this actually, it's kind of like the Shabbos argument, but in other scenarios, if a woman's wearing a wig, she's never going to be tempted to take it off. Come flip the page, I'll show it to you. Source 76. A woman who wears a scarf on her head will tend to take it off in certain cases because of discomfort, as opposed to a woman who dons a wig. Even if President Eisenhower himself walks in, she will not remove it, right? In a sense, a wig is a superior head covering because a full wig covers all the hair, and the woman's never going to take it off. She'll feel comfortable in any situation wearing it, and that's good. On the other hand, you have this tricky issue of, well, does it need to be recognizably a head covering? Maybe, and you have communities, by the way, you have communities where only obvious wigs are considered permissible, or also short wigs, tznius wigs, whatever, tznius wig, meaning these things are really complicated. Actually, the one that's the hardest with this is, are you familiar with kippah falls? So kippah fall is kind of like a partial wig that kind of like goes on the back. And it's sort of like the worst of all worlds halachically, because it's not the worst of all worlds, because there is coverage going on. That's not fair to say it's the worst of all worlds. There is coverage going on, not everything is exposed. But if the big halachic advantage of the wig is that it's giving more coverage and a woman is less inclined to take it off, so the kippah fall isn't really doing that. And if the disadvantage of the wig is it looks like her own hair, the kippah fall, absolutely, that's the whole kind of point, is that the hair in front and the hair in back and it's blended in. and it looks like her hair, it's like real camouflage. At the same time, there's some women for whom that's the only way they're going to be able to do anything, and again, that's certainly better than not doing anything.
Is there an Indian of maritime?
Okay, so this is really a machloket. So Rav Ovadia Yosef, we don't have time, but Rav Ovadia Yosef, I brought it here. Rav Ovadia Yosef was concerned about Marasayan. He was concerned that it would look like you're not following the mitzvah. He didn't think that it was appropriate, and that's why you have a lot of women in that tradition, I think, who will not wear wigs. Rav Moshe Feinstein did not think there was an issue of Marasayan. He felt that in a frum community, it's understood that women are wearing wigs, and people will give each other the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're wearing wigs, and therefore it's not an issue. One of the things I think is most ironic is that I think in recent times, the wig has often come to be seen as more dignified head covering than other forms of head covering. And that's very interesting. Whereas if originally it was the dignified hat, kind of, right? And then modesty was covering the hair. Now you have the wig, which covers the hair, which is seen sometimes as more dignified. By the way, communities where they put a hat on top of a wig are kind of satisfying both, right? They're having the wig, the hair is covered, but then they're doing this extra level of dignifying and making it clear that something additional is going on as a signifier. Okay. We're almost out of time. Very quickly, I apologize, it'll have to be our regular chat. I invite anyone who wants to look in on the TORAH website. We have an article about where, and all of these topics you can look, we've written them up, also about where to cover. But very quickly, we saw, when it comes to where to cover, we saw something really interesting, which is that we kept coming up with latzeit b'frua rosh, right? To go out, or to go out to the marketplace with the head uncovered. And just very quickly, there's a Gemara, and it's a very important Gemara, source 80, where it's talking about this whole idea of the kalta. Well, why is the kalta relevant? Once Dat Yehudit is on the books, and we know that we are not a society that only wants to satisfy the minimum doraita. We're a society that wants to follow halacha. Once we've said that the kalta, that minimal head covering, is only satisfying doraita and not Dat Yehudit, why is it relevant to discuss it at all? Why even bring it up? Source 80, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kalta ein ba mishum frua rosh. He says, well, you don't have the fundamental halacha if you have the kalta on. Havi ba Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera asks the following questions about it. Heicha, where is that actually going to do anything for you? In lema bashuk dat yuditi. If you say in the marketplace, it's not going to be good enough. In the marketplace, you definitely need your Dat Yehudit. We know the kalta is not sufficient. The ela bechatzer, and if you say in a woman's private courtyard that that's where she needs the kalta, wait a minute, a woman needs a kalta in her private courtyard? Im kain lo inachta bat l'Avram Avinu sheyoshevet tach ba'ala. If so, you haven't left a single woman in the religion of Avram Avinu who's still going to stay married. Wow. Meaning he seems to assume, not like what we saw in the Zohar, that in general, women, there were places where women were not covering, including this courtyard. Amar Abaye, v'yitema Rav Kahana, Abaye or Rav Kahana, depending on your tradition, responded, mechatzer lechatzer derech mavoy. Going from one courtyard to another courtyard by an alleyway. That's where you'd use a kalta. Huh? The Gemara seems to be suggesting that there are different gradations of public and private. The most public being the marketplace. The most private, perhaps, or more private being the chatzir, the courtyard. The truth is there's more to discuss with that, how we define the courtyard, how private it is. But for now, we'll just say the courtyard. And then there's this in-between zone, where you're going from one courtyard to another. And the suggestion in the Gemara seems to be that how your head is covered can vary depending on how private the place is. So that in a marketplace, you need you need Dat Yehudit. There are no compromises. In your private zone, there seems to be room, perhaps, and this is a machloket, perhaps for nothing at all in your private zone. Nothing at all. Okay? One of the debates becomes, well, if someone not from your household comes into your private zone, is it still private? Okay, and that's where we have women who might not always cover at home, but if there's a guest there, will. And then there's this in-between zone. I think the modern day equivalent of this in-between zone might be something like you're living in a building and you have a little area in front of your apartment in the hallway. Or it might be the laundry room, or it might be the stairwell. And it actually might depend on the building and how public those different spaces are. But the idea that the Gemara is laying out is depending on how public the space is, you have a different level. Once a space is truly public, and we wind up la'alacha usually saying that if there's people passing through who are not parts of your household, we usually treat it as public. Once a space is truly public, everything, 100% datudid. When a space is more private, there might be more room. Ways this could come into relevance. There's some people who take this to all the way to say, no, even if I'm having someone over for Shabbos, in my home, my head is uncovered. Okay? That is a valid halachic tradition. Okay? However, if they go to their friend's house, they can't do that. Right? Or, and this is something a little different, someone who might, in general, when she's going out, have her head covered a certain way, but if there are guests over, might be a little more relaxed about some hair coming out of her head covering. There seems to be halachic room for that. A little bit like tznius in general, if you think about it, where the norms of what it means to be dignified and modest if you're going out, say, to the store, are a little different. You might go in a house robe to your laundry room in your building. You might go out in slippers to grab the paper right in front of your house, right? Or in your backyard. Meaning, it sounds like those kinds of gradations, there's the fundamental halacha that we're not going to compromise on. But it sounds like those kinds of gradations, when it comes to dat Yehudit, or sort of going beyond the fundamental halacha, there might be some room depending on who's there in what circumstance. That can become particularly relevant also for sometimes for women for whom it's really difficult, knowing that there's kind of more room to be a little less punctilious at home can actually make a huge difference in being able to fulfill the mitzvah sometimes. So this is something definitely, that was al regel achad, we have to stop. That was al regel achad. It's something that I would encourage you to learn more, to ask shilas about, not to jump into. But it's important to know that there is a basis for saying that there is a distinction between different settings. Also, all women's settings, like a private exercise class or something like that, we tend to be the same way that we might dress differently there than we dress in the marketplace, okay? So it's important to know that that exists in the world of head covering as well. Okay, I'm going to have to end here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope this just gets you more interested in learning more and in connecting more to this mitzvah. Thank you very, very much.